I don't think it's any secret that I've been loving Lost Ark for these past few months, that the game has been out for the West, and there are a fair amount of reasons for that, but you've seen the title of the video. Today I'll be talking about the raids of Lost Ark, as I think they are some of the best raid encounters that I have experienced up till now. And then I'm not just talking about the raids being some of the best pieces of content about Lost Ark, I mean that the raids are some of the best raids that I have played in all of my time raiding in different MMOs. So let's get into why that is. Now, Lost Ark uses the term raid very loosely. There are Guardian raids, which are your day-to-day bosses that you will be fighting, which are best compared to Monster Hunter fights. You're dropped into a map that has a Guardian, aka a monster in it, and you have to go hunt it down. There's very few AoE indicators, and you're mostly reading the body language of the boss to predict and dodge incoming attack patterns. Each boss has their own specific attacks that they'll use throughout the fight, and some bosses will also get additional variations as they get lower in HP, but there's usually not a lot of structure to a fight. It's usually just random patterns that are being thrown at you, and maybe the boss will try to flee once they hit a certain HP threshold, and then you go into a final phase where they add some new stuff, but it's not something that I would personally call a raid encounter. Another piece of content are the Abyss raids. Now, some of these were removed from the game, but here in the West we still have the Argos Raid. Now, Argos is a little bit more like a normal raid encounter that I'm used to from playing Final Fantasy, for example, as it does have multiple phases and each phase has their own set of normal patterns, but also has some more actual mechanics thrown in. But the fight is still mostly comprised of normal patterns. So while it does get a little bit closer to that of a normal raid encounter, it's still leaning closer to a Monster Hunter fight than an actual raid boss. Then in come the Legion raids, and these are the raid encounters that I want to focus on today, as these Legion raids are the content that I would call an actual raid. The main reason for that is because they are structured like a more traditional raid encounter that we know of from MMOs like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy. The way it works in Lost Ark is that each encounter has their special patterns, aka the big mechanics, at certain HP values. So once a boss hits, let's say, 120 HP bars, he'll do this mechanic, and then when he hits 100 HP bars, he'll do that. And that goes on for the remainder of the fight. Now, to fill in the blank space between these HP thresholds, the boss will still mix in normal patterns that we've come to know from doing these Guardian raids and Abyss raids. So it still keeps that Lost Ark feeling of a fight. And it is the combination of these two different types of attacks that make for a very enjoyable raid encounter. So why is that? Well, on one hand, it's important to know when these big mechanics are going to be happening so that you can prepare yourself for them. But on the other hand, you also need to learn how to read the boss's body language so that you can react accordingly to the normal patterns that will be thrown your way between these major mechanics. The reason why this is so enjoyable is because you always need to pay attention to what is going on in the fight. Something that I have with Final Fantasy, for example, is that once you've done a fight enough, you know the script that is being played for the boss. You know when mechanics are going to be happening, you also know how to handle them every single time as it's all fixed. Most of the randomness to the mechanics is something like, will it be in or out? Is it going to be stack or spread? And while some mechanics have a little bit more randomness to them in terms of which role you are going to be playing in the mechanic itself stays the same, and how it will be resolved also stays the same as well. So the fight is very predictable. In Lost Ark, while we still have this predictability with the major mechanics that happen at certain HP thresholds, but everything else between that is all going to be random. So you never really doze off during a fight, as you always need to be on the lookout for what the boss will do next and then react accordingly to that. This also adds a fairly deep layer of mastery into a raid, because a lot of the time you just don't need to learn how to read certain attacks as they just deal very little damage, or the aftermath of the mechanic is easy to dodge even without proper setup for it. And even if you were to fail a mechanic, you can most often just use a potion, or maybe a support can just heal you up. It's usually not a big deal if you can't read all the normal patterns. But once you get to a point where you can read most or even everything that the boss is doing, it gives me a lot of satisfaction that I'm able to make it through a fight without getting hit by any or many mechanics. And when it comes down to counter patterns, if you're able to read those in advance, then you can give your team a very big window of damage opportunity, which then also gives a great feeling in return for you. So it's just a really nice combination of things. The major mechanics of a fight you'll learn to execute very quickly, as they always happen at the same intervals, but the random patterns usually take a little bit more time to get down, as you need to learn the boss's body language to identify them quickly, and you might not always know what to look out for in the first place when you first start encountering these normal patterns. And then once you do finally learn all of the tells of the boss, that then gives me a lot of satisfaction again as well. Another aspect of the Legion raids is the Sidereal Gauge. If you've played Final Fantasy before, you can kind of compare this to a limit break, although different raids will give different sidereals to you. Now, the reason why this gauge is kind of cool is because it allows you to interact with mechanics in a different way. It can change how you handle mechanics quite drastically, actually. Sometimes it can be used as a safety net, giving you a big defensive boost to live through a mechanic that is very easy to mess up. Other times it can completely change how you handle a mechanic. Let's take Vicus Gate 3 for example. Now, the PF strat for this fight is to just use Nineveh whenever it's available to push DPS on the boss, because that's what Nineveh does. She just deals a lot of damage. But because my group has pretty good damage, the fight is already fast enough that we don't really need to use Nineveh, so we use our limit break for something else. Now, one of the major mechanics in this encounter is the stagger check. Now, you can see a bar above all of our heads, which I will be referring to as our simp gauge, because if this fills, you start simping for the boss and then you start attacking your teammates. Now, the stagger check has a few components to it. One, you need to complete the stagger check, so deplete the boss's stagger bar. Then there's also two adds, one on the top, one on the bottom of the map, that need to be killed or they will do a big attack that turns you into a simp if you don't die to the attack in the first place. And while the boss's stagger bar isn't depleted yet, there will also be a puddle around her that is going to slowly fill up your sim gauge. So the way how Party Finder does this is you first deplete your sim gauge by activating one of the orbs around the arena. That way you can stand next to the boss without going full simp, but to attack the two adds, you need your simp gauge to be above a certain threshold, so you can't attack them now. So what you do instead is you use a time stop potion right before the two adds explode, which allows you to ignore that part of the mechanic. So TLDR, you drop your gauge, complete the stagger check, and then you use a time stop potion to survive the explosion from the adds. Fairly simple. The way my group does it, however, is we use a sidereal for it. So what we do is we do not cleanse our sim gauge, because we want it to be high to attack one of the adds. The other add and the boss's stagger bar will be taken care of by the sidereal way, which is the one that we're going to be using for this one, and that responsibility comes down to the party leader. So this way, there isn't any timing that you need to learn to not die to the explosion of the adds. You also save one of the cleanse orbs in case you need it for later, and this also allows you to go into one of the next mechanics with a high sim gauge, which is good because you want a high sim gauge for that specific mechanic, and if you don't have it right at the start of the mechanic, then you'll take more time to complete it, and you're on a timer for this one, so the faster you can start, the better. And because this also allows us to save one of the orbs, we can use it afterwards to make sure that one of our final mechanics is much safer if we were to need it. Hopefully that wasn't all too confusing, but what it comes down to is that you can change the way the fight plays out quite a lot, depending on how you want to be using this sidereal gauge. So to sum it all up, you need to learn the big mechanics so that you can make it through the fight in the first place. Then you can start learning the body language of the bosses so that you have a better time reacting to the random attacks that are being thrown at you, and you won't need as much healing as you would if you just keep getting hit by stuff. And if a strategy isn't working for your group or you want to try something different, then you could use these sidereals to change how you handle a certain mechanic or even how you want to approach a very big part of the fight in general. And all of these things together make for a great raiding experience that keeps being fun even months down the line. It's a bit unfortunate that the Legion raids are fairly deep into Lost Ark's endgame, but with the current catch-up mechanics that are in place, they are definitely worth the time investment to get there, as they are some of the best raids that I have played in all of my time raiding in games. And that's pretty much everything that I wanted to say today, so I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my patrons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.